Democracy. We no longer live in a world of nations and ideologies. The world is a college of corporations, inexorably determined by the immutable bylaws of business. The world is a business. And I have chosen you to preach this evangel.
For all my free market healthcare robbing, stock stealing, retirement fund fucking with niggas. Fuck you little credit card scam and jewelry stealing, crack selling, liquor store robbing motherfuckers. Shout to the homies, Carnegie, OG, Willie Randolph Hearst, Baruch, Rockefeller, the real Rockefeller, my main bitch Leona, pour out a little Louis the 13th. Scott Rothstein, Jack Abramoff, hold your head. My Rothschild niggas, let's get this money. I spend my day peppering America overseas. Pension for the workers, nigga, please. Embezzlement, etiquette, private settlement. I'm better with Confederate rhetoric from my mansion in Connecticut. Foreclose if it close out the tenement. I twist words like a speech impediment. I hope you got good credit, bitch. If not, better get a new job with benefits. While I play golf with niggas and get cheddar with. New money buys brand new carrots. My old money bunch of great grandparents. You got grills in your mouth, I ain't mad at you. I own every gold mine in South Africa. Thanks, baby, you made me $1 billion. Plus, I own a building for each one of my children's children.
Hey, I sincerely apologize that I had some technical difficulties starting up the show, but this is Chris J. I am live here Sunday night, about 9:10 Eastern Time. Uh, Again, 9:09 Eastern Time. I sincerely apologize. It took all the way to 9:09. It's 9:09 Eastern Time. I had some problems signing into Skype, but I finally got through. So here we are, Voice of Rebellion Radio at UCY.tv. Thanks everyone who tuned in tonight. And tonight we were talking about Syria. We had more strikes from the United States coalition in Syria against the Assad government. The strikes took place in southern Syria on Thursday, and now has resulted in more heightened tensions. And the difference between these strikes and the first strikes that happened back in April is that these strikes were not in proportional response, in the words of the United States government, but these were to stop what they said were advanced enemy targets towards the rebels. Southern Syria has been kind of a hotbed for some of the action in Syria. Down in southern Syria is where the Israeli border is, and ISIS has been stuck at the Israeli border, or has been there at the Israeli border, and there's like a small pocket of ISIS right by the Israeli border. Then you have the rebels that control a lot of parts of Western Syria, the so-called moderate rebels, in Eastern Syria, where the ISIS controls a lot of the territory out there. The Syrian conflict has now waged for about 6.5 years, and it's getting crazy. The fact that the prospect of potentially a United States intervention, also followed by, who knows, the Israelis intervening, and whatever Western militaries wish to follow the Americans into this trap that is Syria. And I'll tell you that the Syrian military is a pretty decent military, but if Iran's to get involved, this would be World War III happening if the Iranian military was to take head on the United States military. Iran and Syria have a defense pact that says if one is attacked, the other comes in to help. So if Iran is attacked, Syria's going to come to help. If Iran's attacked or Syria's attacked, Iran's going to come to help. Syria would come to Iran's aid, and if Iran's attacked, Syria would come to help. Iran is probably not going to be attacked first. Syria is probably going to be attacked first, and I could see that very much happening in the first months of the Trump administration. Also, with all this distraction right now, with the FBI probe of Trump and everything, I would totally expect potentially Donald Trump to attack Syria, not to distract from his own FBI probe, but rather to, while people are distracted, they attack. Because right now, Americans are glued to their television thinking that a Nixon ordeal is going to take place where Donald Trump is going to be impeached. And Richard Nixon wasn't impeached, he resigned. It was like a de facto impeachment. Donald Trump, his impeachment would just lead to Mike Pence become the president, another establishment shill. And even if he's revoked too, then Paul Ryan becomes the president. So it's just like down the line, you just see all these different establishment figures. It's like even if Paul Ryan goes, then there's somebody else from the establishment, all the way down to like Mad Dog Mattis becomes the president. And there's Tillerson in there somewhere. But, I believe that if they go down this road of, okay, we're going to impeach Donald Trump or whatever, I think Trump goes, potentially Pence goes, and Tillerson goes. I believe those main three are going to go. And then I think Paul Ryan would become the president, possibly, in that situation. Which, if you remember, Ryan is 100% party establishment. He was on the Romney ticket back in 2012. And pretty much his inspiration is supposedly from Ayn Rand, which is Ayn Rand is pretty much how to be a selfish, narcissistic asshole in a book. I mean, Ayn Rand's literature, nothing really to be admired, and the idea that she was some kind of hero for liberty is ridiculous. And just because she had opposing views towards communism, but when it comes to what seems to be fascistic views, then she didn't seem to have a problem there. And in my opinion, Ayn Rand's views bordered on fascistic and almost to the idea of social Darwinism to an extent, which is pretty much like some people are inferior to others type mentality. And her views definitely I don't agree with, and I don't think that even libertarians should agree with her. I think that Ayn Rand's views more belong to the Tea Party fake libertarians, and a lot of people seem to admire her. I don't, and that's what Paul Ryan's inspiration supposedly is from. Paul Ryan himself is a wannabe, high-level politician. He's currently the Speaker of the House, but I have a feeling that he wants to be eventually the president. And if they take this course of action, not saying that they will, Paul Ryan will become the president of the United States, I believe. Because I think Pence, though, they have too much. They already have. I've seen the media narrative on Pence is pretty much that Pence is also involved with the Russia probe. Tillerson definitely goes because they have an easy thing to point to. Right there's this Order Freedom Medal that he got from Russia. Donald Trump, I don't think he's going to get impeached. Honestly, my prediction still is that Trump is going to serve 8 years, and I believe that he's going to get reelected in 2020, and that's the establishment going to use him for that entire time. But it is starting to get very interesting the way that the media has taken a turn towards the idea of impeachment, and starting to see, handwriting on the wall. And I think that Donald Trump, going into Syria would be very telling. It should be very telling that when he struck Syria, what side he belongs to. If he was on our side, then he wouldn't want to go into Syria, because it's going to lead to World War III, a war that a lot of American people are going to get killed. And, for what? For the Israelis' interest, for the bankers' interest, but not for American people's interest. As the American people have it's like, how the hell did our freedom get over there when people say that we're fighting for freedom by going into Syria? It's like, how the hell did our freedom get over there? How's Bashar al-Assad preventing our freedom? He's not. Bashar al-Assad is actually fighting terrorists while our government supports terrorists. One of the main things that our people seem to believe nowadays is that we need a government that effectively fights terrorism. But our government supports terrorism, funds terrorism. It is a terrorist promoter all across the board. And I think that the American government, the Israeli government, all these different governments are getting into Syria right now. This is a big turning point, because if they were to, by some chance lose the war or whatever, if by some chance they were to lose the war, this could massively change things against the globalists. And the tide's already seemed to turn. You know what else I have to say, making a little sports prediction, is that, look, this is the year, this has been the last couple years we've seen some crazy shit happen. When it comes to sports, we've seen the Cubs win the World Series. Something that in 108 years never happened. We saw the Cleveland Cavaliers come back from 3-1. Okay? We've seen, what was that one over in Europe where the team came back from being like down 6-1 an aggregate score. Okay? We've seen a lot of crazy shit over the last few years when it comes to sports and in the world alike. I mean, Donald Trump becoming the president would have shocked a lot of us people, even alternative media. So I think that some more crazy or unexpected shit can happen, and it just seems to be the way things are going right now. When it comes to sports right now, I mean, look at who's also about to win, who might be going to the Stanley Cup Finals. We have Nashville, of all teams, Nashville, who beat Chicago Blackhawks, and number 1 seed, and swept them, and they're probably going to go to the Stanley Cup Finals against Ottawa. I mean, it's 2017 has been the year of the unexpected, it seems like, and I think that more of the unexpected might be going on this year, and hopefully, eventually, what that unexpected could mean is the defeat of imperialism, similar to what happened maybe in Vietnam or whatever. Now, I hope it doesn't come at the cost of many American lives. But if imperialism wins, just remember that if the New World Order wins their battle in Syria, that the result is going to affect millions, if not billions, of people down the road, compared to thousands, maybe a couple million that are going to be, unfortunately, are going to be killed in the war in Syria, whatever. Now, I hope the war doesn't happen altogether. I don't want any of the war to happen. But in that situation, is that obviously I'm going to root for the people that are fighting against the New World Order, and hopefully that the New World Order does not succeed in Syria and Iran, because that would be one more step closer to them fulfilling their dream and towards Russia, because that's the next step. If they can win in Syria and Iran, they're going to go towards Russia. That's their final target. It's a big enchilada for them. They go to Russia and they defeat Russia, it's over pretty much. So then they will pretty much declare the New World Order at that point. I mean, I won't say it's over, but it definitely doesn't look good for us. So Syria and Iran's crucial to stopping their march towards Russia, which is their eventual goal, which I think, honestly, the way I see it is that possibly like a War I, War II scenario where a smaller war breaks out now, next couple years, and then down the road, about 20, 30 years, we see a war with Russia going on. And that's a big showdown between fascism and Russia once again, similar to what happened in the 1940s, but not with the corrupt leader on the Russian side like they had Joseph Stalin. It almost cost them the war. You see his reckless policies in the way that he sacrificed so many soldiers. I mean, 27 million Russians died in World War II, which was not necessary whatsoever, really. With more tactical planning, the generals, if he would listen to his generals a bit more, both sides, is the ironic thing is that Hitler and Stalin both did not listen to their generals, and it cost both sides millions of troops. Also, Hitler killed one of his best generals, Rommel, who also probably was not totally on board with the Nazi ideology. That was the thing that Rommel is kind of known more. He was just a patriot towards Germany, but he did not really believe in the ethnic cleansing and the cancerous ideology that is fascism. The ideology of fascism, which is the merger in corporate state power, it's like they try to make it more complex in the school systems. They try to confuse people, but realize that we have definitely reached the state of fascism in America, and we have been a fascist country for a while now. That's one important thing to learn, an important thing to accept when it comes to the state of American politics and the state of the United States today. And also another major thing is that the people that fund our politicians, the Zionists, the Saudis, these are the people that have a lot of influence, and of course the New World Order bankers at the top. The Zionists have a lot of influence over the United States. And we see Donald Trump heading over to Israel, which I can just imagine is going to be the ultimate ass-kissing that we might have ever seen of a president. I mean, this might be more than the Obama ones. I mean, people said that people tried to accuse Obama of being anti-Israeli. There was talk throughout the Obama presidency that he was secretly going to reduce Israel's borders to 1967 borders. Which I laughed at that. The whole idea that there was that our politicians are scheming to screw Israel or whatever. It's a common theme amongst some conservatives in this country, and amongst the, I would say the Tea Party right in this country. Because even the alt-right, it's like a lot of the right wing in this country does not like Israel. Or at least claims to not like Israel, but they follow politicians who like Israel. For example, the alt-right, a lot of them love Donald Trump, but Donald Trump is pro-Israel. And look at the other ones. Mike Pence, all his administration is practically pro-Israel. Steve Bannon's pro-Israel, even though that he seems to harbor kind of hostile views towards Jews as a whole. When it comes to Israel, he seems to be in favor of Israel. Steve Bannon, by the way, is not even part of the Trump administration anymore. Now he's been practically de facto replaced by Jared Kushner, a Zionist neocon. And, that was symbolic, in my opinion. Is that even though the Bannon was a piece of shit, just like Kushner, Bannon represented the outside, not the establishment, while Kushner represented the neocon establishment and the insiders to the government. And is that you have a lot of these type of people in our government too that are, kind of like these side shadow power people. They're not quite at the level maybe like the Rockefellers or Rothschilds or whatever, but they have power in the shadows, and you hear their names, but you don't really hear their names. It's kind of like it's kind of like in a way like Kushner is to Trump right now, and people forget that he's there, but at the same time he is at least talked about on the media. While the Rothschild name is never brought up on the media, the Rockefeller name is never brought up on the media. And it's weird how they try to paint out David Rockefeller as like a philanthropist of some sorts. David Rockefeller is a murdering piece of shit that helped support the coup in 1973 in Chile. Pinochet was brought about by David Rockefeller. And the ironic thing is, there's some people, like some of the people on our right, claim that they claim that Pinochet was somehow against the establishment and was somehow like anti-Zionist or whatever. When Pinochet was definitely pro-Zionist. Pinochet was one of them. Pinochet was directly backed by the most foul pieces of the insider establishment in this country. If you really look at it, Pinochet was a piece of shit that was brought about by the United States government, and I see quite a bit of people, supporting and trying to defend his economic policies and defend his terror that he inflicted on Chilean people. And it's a total revisionism of history, and I hope that's not what's going to happen later on when we are talking about the dictatorship. When we're talking about the Macri or whatever, that this happened the second time. When it comes to these new wave of South American dictators that are supported by the United States, when they fall, what are they going to be forgotten about in 20 more years? And then we're going to be a cycle of this going on in South America, where it just takes, it seems to have a short memory. I mean, we're talking about a lot of these dictators having left in the 90s, some of them even the early 2000s. And just that quickly, within 15 years, people forgot. In my short lifespan, that I've been around, I'm only 19. Some of these dictators had left. Fujimori left in 2000. The end of really the Andres Perez dictatorship, even though that he left in 93 or whatever, ended in 98. Right after I was born, in Venezuela. And you see people totally forgetting about that when talking about Venezuela and, talking very badly about the Bolivian government that's currently in place, but forgetting how much worse the 90s were, the 80s were in Venezuela. It was not like here in the United States. It was not the flashy 80s movies and everything. That here in the United States, it just seems that the slow ownership of this country by the Rothschilds and bankers, our country started getting worse and worse and worse. So that's why we always look at the past fondly, I think, is because it used to be better times. The 80s weren't as bad as today, our shape of our economy, our politics. And then you looked at the 80s, looking back at the 50s, it definitely was a prosperous time in the 50s. And looking back at the 20s, even though you have to go back to 1913 was the last time our country was not totally owned by the banks, and when the New World Order officially bought America on December 23rd, 1913. But I think that's one of the reasons why we always look fondly at our past decades, is because it's just the situation has gradually gotten worse to this point. Our freedoms, our economy, our economy is at one of the most uncertain times in history, where there's the talk of a dollar collapse imminent. We have the talk of martial law imminent. America's not in a good state right now. America is about to go down the toilet currently, and I think it's going to happen with Trump as the president. I don't see Trump fixing anything. I don't see Trump being like a JFK or anything like that. And people are saying have all these different excuses for Donald Trump. I'm done with the excuses. After he struck Syria, it should have been clear to everyone that it really focuses on politics, that Donald Trump was not going to help us. Donald Trump is a neocon puppet, a fascist puppet, and Donald Trump is the epitome of the change and hope, and then we get nothing in the end. Is that we keep changing and hoping every 8 years, and Barack Obama was an example of this. And then we saw what we got with Barack Obama. We ended up getting another establishment puppet, and Obama, Trump, Reagan, who even Reagan is kind of similar. Trump's similar to Reagan in that fact. And that's what really scares me, is that Reagan was a movie actor that became the president. And now we have a reality TV star that became the president. So it's pretty much the same thing over again. And we're seeing a repeating theme. And, Reagan had a big part in, think about all the interventions. We had the Grenada intervention, and we had a lot of also the pushing towards the collapse of the Soviet Union, the way that it happened, which if you look at it, the Soviet Union was not a great thing, was not a great country. However, the collapse of it was worse than many of the years of the Soviet Union. Millions suffered, millions died in the during the 90s, where many people starved. And by the way, we do have a caller coming in. So coming all the way from Australia, we have Jay Sarepal, I believe is how you pronounce his name. But hey, welcome to the show, man. You hear me all right? Hey, welcome to the show, man.
Yeah, just wait a second.
I'm gonna put you. Let's put it on his mic right now. Hey, man, welcome to Voice Rebellion Radio. This is the host, Chris J, and thanks for coming all the way from Australia. That's got to be our longest distance caller that we've ever had, and I wanted to talk about Syria tonight, and this guy talks a lot about Syria on Facebook. He kind of caught my attention, so I invited him to come on tonight. And thanks a lot, man.
Sure. Yeah, no worries.
Hey, I think your audio is off or something like that, because I see you talking on there, and
you can't hear me. You can't hear me. Okay, that's interesting. Let me just check my connections.
I can hear you, but it's like really pretty quiet right now. Let me see. It might be on my end. I'm checking this out.
Yeah, I mean, I've
Oh yeah, I got you.
Okay.
Okay, I can hear you good now.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I mean it's kind of quiet, but I can hear you.
Okay. Are we live or?
Yeah, we are live right now. This is a radio show. It's UCY.TV. We're a alternative media radio channel here in the United States, and we have listeners from all over the place, over in Europe, and many. I've had guests from Ireland, and this is we cover the non-mainstream perspective on the news. And if you listen to my shows, definitely controversial stuff. And when it comes to Syria, I know that you're definitely against the mainstream narrative that's being pushed right now about Assad being this brutal dictator, and all these many things are being spouted right now. But we saw the strikes on Thursday that happened against the paramilitary, I believe, that were aligned with the Assad government. Do you think that this is going to lead to a much larger intervention, more strikes, or what do you think is going to be the end game? This is a second strike that's happened in just about a month and a half. This is starting to get a little bit alarming.
I genuinely find it difficult to answer these questions because, I don't have a crystal ball. A few months ago, especially before the airstrikes that the United States conducted against the Shayrat air base in Homs, all got the impression, or at least mildly, that the U.S. government was pulling away from its regime change agenda, and that their new agenda was just to push for the balkanization of the country. And so when the airstrikes were launched, it was a huge shock to many of us. I don't think the United States has the capability to continue doing this. They as in to escalate this to the point where they're at war with the Syrian government, because that would mean going to war with Russia. I think it is fair to say that Russia has been so reserved in terms of how it responds to American aggression that the Americans will keep trying to push the envelope to see how much damage they can do before the Russians actually raise the stakes and respond militarily. Right now, the Russian response has been to respond diplomatically, has been to try and expose the U.S. role for exactly what it is. But as for the U.S. endgame, balkanization is definitely on the agenda. Regime change, no. And the reason isn't because the United States have decided this is a silly policy, it's wrong, we don't want terrorists to come to power. It's because the Syrian people have resisted with their blood for 6 years straight.
Yes, I think that the United States understands totally how dire the stakes are, that if they were ever to put 100,000 troops into Syria, that they might be responded with 100,000 Russian troops, and we're talking about the war of all wars happening.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that the Syrian government, however, I believe that the United States government is still going to seek the removal of Assad by whatever means possible. That's the unfortunate reality I've came to. And what I am worried about is that the United States government knows that the chance that Russia would intervene in that situation is probably actually not too high, because we've seen the United States provoke them in Ukraine many, many times, and the Russian military has shown a lot of restraint to the point where the people in eastern Ukraine don't seem to be actually very happy with the Russian response, because they believe that Putin should be doing more in order to help out the Ukraine. But there's not anything that really Putin can do that would not potentially spark a war there, and spark a war that could trump World War II in size if they ever went to war with the United States. What I do believe, and what I've predicted for about 3-4 years now, is that I think that the United States military is trying to draw Iran into a conflict in Syria as well as Syria in order to pretty much just wipe out the last Middle East resistance countries. And that's the whole goal of this upcoming war. I don't think that the United States has their eye on Russia quite yet, but I believe that the United States government is looking. And I don't just mean the United States government. I believe the people behind the United States government, the think tanks, the Council of Foreign Relations, the bankers that finance the United States government, that their ultimate end game in Syria is to pretty much just finish their Middle East objectives. And remember, is that back in 2007, Wesley Clark said that they were going to wipe out 7 countries in 5 years.
Yeah.
Now they're actually 10 years along with that, and they have not gotten to 2 of those countries, and right now actually really 3, because they wanted to take out Yemen, and Yemen's actually kind of reversed because they had the popular uprising in 2015. And now Yemen might be factionalized, but at the same time, the people that ultimately control the capital are not friendly to the West, not friendly to Israel. And also Lebanon's even going in the opposite direction. Really, in a way, they've actually went way back on their plans. So I think that the drastic measures that the United States government is going to take is going to be a response to a lot of the people in the Middle East are finally uprising towards the Zionist American influence. And really, when you think about it, 5 countries have really there's been a massive upheaval against the Western plans. I mean, even Iraq, there's been a strong call to alliance themselves with Iran. They have alliance themselves with Iran in militarily against ISIS, which I think has upsetted the United States tremendously. It's definitely I can see a massive response possibly happening because the United States government in the West is getting desperate. And they're also getting desperate for more war to continue their charades in the Middle East. Is that the fact is that Iraq and Afghanistan have kind of they've kind of overstayed their welcome. It's been 16 years. The American people are wondering what's the next step? What's the next country? And if they can make a new boogeyman, which they make every few years, whether it's the Soviet Union back in the 1970s and 80s, it was the Taliban, Iraq in the 2000s. Now it's going to be Syria and Iran for the 2010s going into 2020s. I think that's what is happening is the shift. There's the new boogeyman, the new enemies for the American war machine.
Yeah. Okay. I think I'm actually doing my PhD on this topic, right? So the question that I'm asking is, did conflicting energy interests ignite the new Cold War? And when I submitted my proposal, one of the things that I mentioned was that certain countries in the Middle East were initially configured as very conservative, anti-communist buffer states in order to contain the Soviet Union. These countries were Turkey, Iran, Iraq as well at one point, during the reign of the monarchy, before the Baathists took over, and of course Pakistan. Pakistan planned 1980s, the same role that Turkey is playing today. So Pakistan was used as a launch pad against the Afghan government to try and bring about regime change there. And the reason the United States didn't like the Afghan government is because it was developing friendly, close ties with the Soviet Union. It's not because the Soviet Union invaded, which is the propaganda term. There was an intervention to defend the Afghan government from being toppled by Islamist reactionaries backed by Pakistan, just as today the Russians have intervened in Syria to prevent Islamist reactionaries from toppling the Syrian government. But the thing is, what's happened recently is that Pakistan has been conducting military drills with Russia. So now they're closer to Russia than they've ever been. Pakistan has also said to the Saudi government that they're not willing to support the war effort against Yemen. Previously, the Saudis had asked Pakistan to intervene in a really, really big way to help them out in their war, their genocidal war against the Yemeni people, and the Pakistani parliament said no. There's some indication that they're willing to help, but not to the same extent. So Pakistan is being torn between different spheres of influence. On the one hand, they consider Iran to be good friends. On the other hand, they consider Saudi Arabia to be good friends, which is something that cannot hold. Eventually, they're going to have to take sides. Historically, they've considered the United States to be a good friend, but ever since the war on terror from 2001 onwards, and ever since the Pakistani Taliban emerged on the scene in 2007, Pakistani public opinion broadly has been very, very suspicious about what American motives in the region are, to put it lightly, especially given that a lot of these Islamist groups that are waging war against the Pakistani government are supported by Saudi, which is a US ally. The reason I bring this up is because the original jihad against the Afghan government launched from Pakistan as its home base, right? Created the conditions for the emergence of Al-Qaeda, which would eventually re-emerge in Iraq after the invasion in 2003, and then re-emerge in Syria in 2012, when Jabhat al-Nusra emerged on the scene, really from 2011 onwards, right? But what the United States has realized in this entire period, or I think the more kind of level-headed people have realized, is that every attempt that they try and make, and this is the point that you alluded to before, to try and contain countries, to subvert them, they're able to get rid of what they're against. Okay, so in the case of Afghanistan, they got rid of a pro-Soviet government, but they're not able to really make any advances in terms of what they're for, okay? In some cases, they are. So, for example, in Kosovo, that's been turned into an American military base, right? And they're quite successful there because they were able to pull off regime change, and the government in Kosovo is actually pro-US, right? Whereas in the case of Iraq, they haven't been successful at all. They thought they would be able to overthrow the Iraqi government and replace Saddam Hussein with someone like a client, like a client regime, someone like, let's say, the King of Jordan, right? They thought they'd be able to turn Iraq into a country like that. But instead, Iraq, the political system ended up being dominated by political parties that are very friendly towards Iran. And so that's why Iraq, while it was under US occupation, was unable to actually the United States wasn't able to get what they wanted from it. The United States wanted to get all of the oil contracts, but instead, even while the United States was occupying the country, Iraq's Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki, on his watch, the most lucrative oil contracts were actually given to the Russians and the Chinese, and not to the Americans. And so the United States failed there, and they left in disgrace. They destroyed the country, but in terms of being able to build something new, they failed. Then they realized that, oh my God, Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, they're going to form a contiguous alliance, like a contiguous regional alliance. And this is damaging to U.S. interests and also to the interests of the Zionist occupiers of Palestine, because these countries are able to develop. Obviously, Iraq's been knocked out of the game for a while because they've been so heavily damaged by war that it's difficult to say that they could actually return to being a major resistant state. But in any case, the formation of the resistance axis was a major threat, and the potential for Iraq to become a powerful country again was a major threat. Only this time Iraq would not be an enemy of Iran, it would be a friend of Iran. And Syria would be a friend of Iran and Iraq as well. And of course, Hezbollah is like the frontier state with the Zionists, right? And so when the United States looked at this potential, like the possibility of this happening, they said, okay, knock out Syria, and they failed. And in failing, they've only brought these countries closer and closer together.
Yes, I would say that's what is going on right now, is that you see Syria, Iraq, and Iran are closer than they've ever been. It's odd, actually, when you think about it, is that Iraq and Iran actually being friends with each other for once. I mean, you think about the 1980s, and the fact is that the Americans pitted them against each other, and Iraq and Iran had one of the most bloodiest wars in man history. I mean, over 1 million people died in that war between Iraq and Iran.
Yeah.
And Iraq, nowadays, you're right, they've been taken out the game, and at this point, they're not going to be much of a player, not even in the Middle East, because of how ravaged they've been by 16 years of war and so many governmental changes and whatnot. I believe that, my opinion, I think that the United States government allowed ISIS to overrun that country like they did because they were mad at the sitting government in the country, and it was pretty much just like a double regime change. They took out Saddam. The government that took out Saddam now was no longer on their side, so now they had to try to take him out again. Now, there's two conflicting schools of thoughts when it comes to the American role with ISIS. That some people believe that ISIS is a direct, controlled organization by the United States and Israel and Western governments, and that ultimately their role is to make Saudi-type governments in Syria, Iran, other countries where they may pose a threat. And there's also the school of thought that they're more of a destabilizer, and they would, in the end, discard them after they've already done the role of taking out the other government, and then in the power vacuum, they install the more moderate, Western-friendly government. I believe it might be a little bit of both, to be honest. I think that there's probably definitely direct inserts from the American, Israeli intelligence that are in the ISIS ranks right now. I mean, they've pretty much caught these people that are directly out of, like, the United States. They're from Chicago, Illinois, or whatever, and they have, like, there was one, I don't know how true it was, they had, like, United States Army tattoos or whatever, like, directly going from, like, the United States military to ISIS's military. And there's also probably people in there that believe that this is actually like a legitimate anti-Western organization and that they're fighting for jihad or whatever, not realizing the Western roots of the organization, nor see past the phony ideology. I think that both those people are low ranking. I think that al-Baghdadi, or whatever the hell his real name is, all those people at the top, I believe they have connections. They're at least talking to Western governments. Look, there was the attack or whatever on the Israeli military in Syria from ISIS, and ISIS apologizes to the Israeli military. There's definitely communication happening between ISIS and Western militaries, direct communication, whether they're getting direct orders from the United States and other Western governments, or whether it's more of a, more like a spin-off group that kind of does their own things, but at times they'll refer to these Western.
I've got a lot to talk about. Sorry to.
No, that was actually the end of my
point. Do you want to continue? Or?
No, that was actually the end of my point. You go ahead.
Oh, right. Yeah, firstly, just with regards to what you said earlier, when I said that the United States hasn't really achieved much in terms of what they're for, they have achieved something in terms of, severely weakening governments that are a threat to Israel. So it's always been like a long-standing plan of the Zionists to weaken and ultimately destroy three countries: Egypt, Iraq, and Syria, because these are the three countries that, are not ruled by British-backed monarchies, which is what the Saudis and the Jordan and the government of Jordan, the Kingdom of Jordan, are. They're actually modern, pro-Soviet aligned, socialist-leaning countries, right? That is Egypt under Nasser, especially the Ba'athists in Syria and Iraq as well, and so. The very fact that these countries have been destroyed to a certain degree. I mean, Egypt, the destruction was more political. That was more about convincing Anwar Sadat to make peace with Israel. Whereas Iraq, in order to neutralize the Iraqi threat towards the Zionists, they had to actually go in there, invade, and then destroy the country, depleted uranium, like an entire generation just ruined. I mean, what happens is when the United States invades, Iraq or any other country, and when they, murder the youngest and the best and the brightest and the most patriotic citizens of that country, then the ideological kind of makeup of that country changes. They become less kind of passionate about, for example, the Arab nationalist cause of liberating Palestine, and they become more focused on simply surviving, right? And that's what Syria has gone through. Prior to the war, Syria was a proud Arab nationalist state. It had, a strong army. It had a population that fully supported the Palestinian resistance. And today they still do, don't get me wrong. But because they've been so severely weakened, this is something that we'd have to be kind of delusional to say that Israel doesn't benefit from this, right? That being said, onto your second point, I don't think it's fair, for example, to make it seem like everything that's happening in Syria, everything that's happening in Iraq is because of Israel. It's not fair to basically put Israel at the center of this conspiracy, if you know what I mean. And then to say, oh, the Turks are taking orders from Israel, the Jordanians as well, as are the Qataris, as are the United States even. Sometimes I listen to like conservative, libertarian-leaning anti-Zionists, and they make it seem like, Israel controls the United States, and I think, look, like calm down a little bit. Every different party to this conflict, whether it's in Syria or Iraq, they have their own agency. Okay, Islamic State has its own agency. If the American agenda was to topple the Syrian government, why was there a conflict? Why is there continually a conflict between Islamic State and the other militias that are fighting the government? Why have Jaish al-Islam beheaded Islamic State fighters, right? The fact is that there is a genuine contradiction. There is a genuine conflict of strategy between Islamic State and the so-called moderate rebels, right? And I can tell you what that contradiction is. The Islamic State, they felt that the best strategy would be to establish a state, whereas Jabhat al-Nusra said, no, before we establish a state, we have to overthrow the state that already exists, which is the Syrian government, right? And this difference over strategy ultimately boiled over into this major kind of fanatical hatred that these two groups have towards each other. However, at the same time, they will cooperate with each other, right? So they have their own agency. That's the only point that I'm trying to make. If we were to go to the point of saying ISIS is completely and directly controlled by the United States, then you'd have to go further and say, okay, well, in that case, Jabhat al-Nusra, to some extent, by opposing Islamic State, is also opposed to the interests of the United States. And that, to me, sounds absurd. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. And ultimately, how I see what's going on in Syria is that it's conflicting groups in the opposition of ultimately the same root. Now, I'm not saying that the United States directly created every single opposition group that exists in Syria. Of course not. But the United States did create pretty much the opposition as we know it. Ultimately, with the Free Syrian Army and all these split off groups, ultimately have an original. If you look at the tree that they sprouted off of, it's ultimately the tree of American-backed Arab Spring, whatever you call it, that's happened in Syria in the last few years. Now, ISIS, in my opinion, is probably not 100% controlled back by the United States or Israel. I think there's definitely some people in there that are not aware of the Western roots of the organization, and there's probably definitely a different members that have different amounts of connection towards the United States. Now, when it comes to Israel, and their whole role, and the thing is, I can see why people believe that Israel is ultimately the ones puppet masters, if you say, in the whole Syrian situation and across the Middle East, is because they see the Israeli connection to our politicians via the fact that they have the most strongest lobby in America, AIPAC. So they, in my opinion, ultimately, Israel's not even at the end of the game. Israel's not the ones the highest when it comes to the most powerful people. I think that in some ways the Israeli government does have more say, though, when it comes to foreign policy, than America's foreign policy than even our own politicians. I won't say that they are directly making all the orders for American politicians. I think that ultimately goes back to, like I was saying earlier, the think tanks, the Council of Foreign Relations, the Bilderbergers, the all these big giant organizations that you don't even hear about, where the top political people in the world meet. And then, of course, the most powerful banking families, Rothschilds, Rockefellers, all these, elite families that have more money than even Forbes will list, because Forbes keeps these people practically in the shadows. Is that they say that the guy from Amazon is the richest guy in the world right now. That's not true. Well, they might be the most singular richest person, but when it comes to a family, private fortunes, you have the Saudi family has over $1 trillion. You have the Rockefellers, they're probably in the trillions when you add all their wealth together. And then you got the Rothschilds, who are the richest family on the planet because they practically control most of the Western banking as we know it. Their banks own pretty much all the smaller banks. They're the biggest sharks in the banking game. If you control the printing of currency, if you control the money manipulation yourself, who's even to say what kind of money you have? I mean, it's just like at that point, you pretty much own money itself. But how it relates all back to the Middle East, also another thing is that Syria is part of the greater Israel project. That's another reason why a lot of people say that Israel's behind the Syrian conflict is because they believe that, and I believe that Israel's ultimate eyes are not just on the West Bank, Gaza, and completely taking over that. It's also eventually moving in from the Niles to the Euphrates. I mean, that's ultimately what their founders wanted, is from all the way from Egypt into Iraq. And you look at the wars, Syria, Iraq, and also where there's been a lot of political disruption since the creation of the state of Israel. We've had we've had what happened with Anwar Sadat, him being killed. We had the years of Mubarak and him acting as pretty much a client dictator for the West. And then you have the recent upheavals of Arab Spring, 2013 uprising. Egypt's been one of the most affected countries by American Western-backed uprisings over the last 60, 70 years. It definitely does look like it when you look at all the coincidences that Israel is definitely eyeing the eventual annexation, maybe not anytime soon, but that's their ultimate goal, the Greater Israel Project. I don't think that they abandoned it. I think that they, all the way since back the time of Thomas Herzl and the original Zionist founders, that they still have the same zeal of colonialism of the Middle East. And even if they don't take it over directly, they're probably hoping to take it over where they put a client state in Syria, a client state in Iraq, client state in Egypt. And they don't have that practically in Egypt. Look how Sisi's been treating the Palestinians that try to escape to his country. He floods the tunnels and everything. El-Sisi's practically acted like a Israeli governor of Egypt. He's not even acting like a sovereign leader, what he's done the last 4 years. And there's the same thing with Mubarak. I don't see it changing anytime soon.
I mean, look, about the Egyptian thing, like the relationship between Egypt and Israel. Let's suppose, for example, that the Egyptians were to do something a lot more radical and start opening the border between Gaza so that more weapons could flow through to the Palestinian resistance, right? If they were to do that, then they would have to face the consequences of Israeli aggression. And quite frankly, I don't think the Egyptian army is in a position to be able to deal with that threat. Like, dealing with such a threat requires not just a strong army, but it requires strong leadership. It requires a population that is ideologically driven towards that cause, right? Whereas, because it's been like so many years since Gamal Abdel Nasser died, and he died in 1970, like that kind of the deeply Arab nationalist kind of current in Egypt has, in a sense, been withering away. So it's actually not easy for a country like Egypt to kind of snap out of it and all of a sudden become a resistance state. It takes like decades. But as for the other points about Israel and like their relationship over everything, we have to concede one thing, which is that for the so-called Syrian opposition, whoever they are, moderate rebels or the exiles based in Turkey, it is embarrassing for them to be associated with Israel. Okay, because all over the Middle East, if there's one country that kind of rallies public opinion to right, it's Israel, right? And so for them to kind of publicly say, yes, we support Israel, we want them to help us and all that kind of stuff, it's embarrassing for them. Yes, there have been opposition figures like Kamal Labwani, for example, who have been very open about asking the Israelis to invade Syria and to set up safe zones, right? And I'll tell you one funny thing about that guy, Kamal Labwani, is that in 2007, I believe, he was jailed by the Syrian government for encouraging a foreign power to invade and attack Syria, and that's exactly what he proceeded to do after 2011 when he was released by the Syrian government in the prisoner releases that they had, right? So, when we talk about Israel, I mean, we have to be a little bit careful. That being said, I think they certainly do have an interest in overthrowing the Syrian government. They are the only country to have routinely launched airstrikes against the Syrian government in ways that benefit al-Nusra. They are the ones that provide medical treatment to Jabhat al-Nusra in the Golan Heights. Al-Masdar News has provided footage of Israeli ammunition and weaponry in general that they've captured from the Free Syrian Army or Jabhat al-Nusra. And the airstrikes that Israel has launched against Syria have been going on for far longer than the ones launched by the United States. We have to remember that the first one launched by Trump against the Shayrat airbase in Homs was the first American airstrike against. Well, we had an accidental bombing run last year, so-called accidental on purpose, last year in September when the United States and Australia accidentally, they claim, murdered 80 Syrian soldiers. But the first time that they intentionally, or like they themselves claim to have intentionally attacked the Syrian government was this year, But before that, ever since 2013, the United States, Israel, every few months or so, has been launching airstrikes against the Syrian government. As for their broader plans, and whether Israel wants a greater Israel, there was a time when that was certainly a part of their agenda. So, for example, Menachem Begin was definitely someone who believed in this idea of having a greater Israel, right? But then, and they thought they'd be able to achieve it when they invaded Lebanon. When they invaded Lebanon, they fought against the Syrian government. Syria lost about 1,000, 2,000 soldiers, and they lost about 80 planes. And Israel only lost one plane. It was an absolute rout in the air, right? So the Israeli Air Force completely destroyed the Syrian Air Force. On the ground, it was a far more even fight, but at the end, they were able to occupy the south of Lebanon, right? And they thought, okay, if we're able to occupy the south of Lebanon, and if we're able to support a pro-Israeli government in Beirut, which is what they wanted the Phalange to do, right? Which is to create this right-wing, pro-Western, pro-Israeli government in the north of Lebanon, so Beirut and to the north of Beirut, that they would be able to basically annex more territory that way. And then once they'd been successful in building this, additional occupied territory, then they might be able to move further and further on, right? Then we know what happened in Lebanon. They were defeated and humiliated, right? They left in 2000. Then in 2006, they thought they could invade and succeed, but they weren't because Hezbollah, destroyed them, right? Well, I apologize. I'm recovering from a flu. And so because they were defeated in 2006, I think they've been a lot more cautious about what their plans are. From their point of view, what they're worried about is the consolidation of the resistance axis. And from their point of view, the destruction of Syria for them is an almost defensive outcome, right? Because by destroying Syria, it actually removes a threat to their existence, right? Whereas in the past, they were a lot more expansionist, right? Whereas I think, in my estimation, those expansionist aims are nowhere near as pronounced as they used to be.
Yeah, I think that Israel has a more reserved role. They at least tried to show that to the world, is because a huge part of their pitch to the world of why people should support them, why Western governments should support them, is because Israel tries to act like, okay, that our existence as a whole is being threatened, and that all the Middle Eastern countries around us hate us. They pretty much try to make it seem like it's all the Muslim countries against them. Yeah. And if they were to try to do more expansionist moves, then that cover would be blown. And it's ridiculous when you look at it this way. The fact is that, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, all these other countries in the Middle East might act like they have a strong opinion against Israel. But when you look at ultimately strategically, militarily, they're ultimately Israeli allies. Even if they don't have official diplomatic relations, it's all a cover. Really, the only few countries that are actively opposed to Israel, one's Iran, one's Syria that's currently in war, one's Yemen that only controls a quarter of their own country. I think it's 50% of their population that was controlled by the Houthi government, but still. And Lebanon is starting to move. Recently, they had that new prime minister that was elected. I believe he's more
Michel Aoun,
Yeah, I believe he's more anti-Israeli than some of the other Lebanese governments they've had before. Lebanon's been a weird thing because they've had Hezbollah, they've had a lot of influence in the country, but a lot of times they would have like a pro-American, pro-Israeli government, official government. But Hezbollah would be like the most powerful military in the country. Lebanon's kind of like a 2 states in 1 state type of deal.
Yeah.
And then you also had at one point you also had like the South Lebanon Army that was pro-Israeli. So that was ultimately like kind of like the Israelis' hopes of an occupying force in the country. So it's almost like really had 3 states really at one point in Lebanon. Israel definitely nowadays they've been trying. Here in America we have a shit ton of propaganda that's pushed by different media outlets about Israel. We like get bombarded by it, and sometimes we have like a radio. They'll be playing the poor Israelis are threatened every day by the Muslim. Well, they won't say Muslim. They'll be like by the Arab countries that are trying to attack them. Please donate dollars to this organization. I'm like, what the hell? We already give them $38 billion or whatever tax dollars. Now we gotta donate even more money to them. That's what they're trying to claim on the radio and TV. We get sometimes like sad commercials and shit like poor Israeli people, which I'm sure there are poor Israeli people, but ultimately that's a problem of their own economic system. And it's not something that's a problem from the country threatening them or anything like that.
Can I just say something about that?
Like they have to use all their money on military, so their people starve and stuff like that. And I have to think is that look, we have a country that so many people are in poverty right now. Israel's way better off than America is right now. I mean, we have like 50% of our people are poor in America, under the poverty level, and then we have like 80% if they lost their next paycheck would go homeless. But they're telling us that we need to send more money over there to help. They have a huge role. The Israeli media or Israeli media manipulators have done a really good job in manipulating the image that Americans see Israel as, not as a thriving, strong military country, but they try to make it seem like our weak, defenseless ally in the Middle East, that we must do whatever we can to defend. They tell us even our churches are even to the point where, you go to church or whatever, and then you might hear something like, it's like, oh yeah, please pray for our Israeli brothers as they fight Palestinian terrorists or whatever. A lot of our churches are so controlled by Zionist narratives, and they've completely spun everything around. You know what I have to think is that, okay, ancient Israel, like described in the Bible, shouldn't God be protecting them? They don't need this gigantic military. If they really, if God was really on their side, like the Bible says, in ancient Israel, they did not have like a huge military, whatever, and ultimately a military built by American F-16s and everything. Another thing is that people forget who ultimately is also victims in the whole situation. It's not just Muslims that are victims in Palestine. There's a lot of Christians there too. Christians that get their churches vandalized by Zionist settlers, Christians that are ultimately Palestinians 100%, and Christians are not treated well unless you are also supportive of the Zionist state. Now, if you go over there and buy the entire Zionist Christian hodgepodge of ideology when you go over there, then they'll treat you pretty good. But if you are Christian and still defend the Palestinians, they're going to treat you like any other Palestinian person over there. And look what happened to our own Rachel Corrie 13 years ago. She ultimately got ran over by an Israeli bulldozer. Is that they've tried to make it seem like that the Israelis are poor defenses and that the Israeli people love us back, or the Israeli government loves us back, when ultimately we've seen is that they only love us back when we're supportive of them. And to anybody that's not supportive of the Israeli state, they are just treated like any other so-called enemy to Israel. But, that's enough about Israel for now. Is that, there's people, I'll go on and on, honestly, if no one stops me. I mean, I will rant quite a bit about them, but at the same time, I'll rant about the American government. I'm pretty easy. At least I'm not like, and I see some of these people are absolutely ridiculous. Like, you talk about like American conservative libertarians or whatever. And there's one guy that's, he's real funny about that, David Duke, who will be like supportive of it, or he'll be anti-Israel, but he loves Trump. He's like, he all joined into the alt-right thing right now. And David Duke actually used to be like a KKK guy that still has a lot of internet prominence.
Heard of him,
you're familiar with him. But
there's definitely. Can I just say something about?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Just about like Israel. I think if you live in the United States, then the angle that it's most strategic to work in terms of anti-war activism is to talk about like severing the need to sever links with Israel. And the reason for that is because you can actually appeal to people in terms of straightforward economics. You can say to them, look, what do the American people who, as you mentioned, are going through all of these economic difficulties and, recession, unemployment, poverty, social issues, like why are we, when we have all of these problems, right? Why are we giving $38 billion every year to Israel? That's something that appeals to a lot of people. And then on that foundation, you can start to kind of build. And eventually, I think you will have a critical mass of people in the United States from both left and right saying we have to sever relations with Israel. That being said, I mean, the reasons that the left would give for opposing Israel are a lot more honest and less bigoted than the reasons that the right gives. So, for example, David Duke, he's anti-Israel, but his reasons are ultimately anti-Semitic. And reasons that we would obviously not sympathize with. That being said, one interesting thing that I've always found is if you speak to Eastern Christians and if you speak to members of Eastern churches, they've always been pro-Palestine because the way they see it, this foreign entity of colonizers have come to, a part of the world where Christians historically have thrived, and they've imposed themselves and expelled and massacred the native population, a significant percentage of whom are Christians. That's how a lot of Eastern Christians see it. And so when you speak to a lot of Eastern Christians, they say, look, what's up with these Western Christians? They're totally mad. They love Israel for some reason, right? And then some of them take it to like strange anti-Semitic conclusions, and they say, oh, okay, well, we're supposed to hate the Jews because the Jews killed Jesus and all that kind of stuff. But this is culture war stuff, right? We should be able to separate the culture wars from the need to defend the victims of these policies. As for the reason why we started talking about this, I believe, is because you were talking about Israel's like plans for a greater Israel. But it's not just Israel. I mean, Turkey, for example, has these neo-Ottoman designs, right? Where you have someone like Erdogan who looks towards Syria, looks towards Iraq and Palestine and sees not independent countries, right? But as former realms of the former Ottoman Empire, right? And so their relations are completely different. The Saudis, I think, would have a far easier time of accommodating themselves to Zionist interests because their primary concern these days is Iran. And the reason why they've hated Iran for a long time is because after the 1979 revolution, there was finally in the world an Islamic country, a country calling itself an Islamic state, set in context, not referring to ISIS, country calling itself an Islamic state that was a republic, and that's what Iran was. And that was a threat to all of the monarchies in the Middle East that call themselves representatives of Islam. So there's multiple agendas here. There's a Saudi agenda, there's a Turkish agenda, and there's a Zionist agenda. And the role of the United States really is to coordinate all of these agendas so they can actually work out. But there are major contradictions as well. So, for example, the Turks and the United States do not get along over the question of so-called Rojava, the question of the Kurds in the north of Syria. That's just one example.
Yeah, it's obvious that definitely the three governments that you just mentioned, there's also ultimately different there's different grandiose plans that they want. Of course, when it comes to Erdogan, I believe that in his mind, he's pretty much got himself believing that one day he's going to be like a new sultan or something like that, or as close to a sultan as it could get in the modern times. That's how he sees himself, not realizing how much of a puppet and ultimately he's just a small player in this much larger game than he is. Really, if the United States wanted to take him out in summer 2016, they could have. The only thing that really stopped them. Some people, actually, there's a couple conclusions. Some people say that the Russians helped or whatever to stop Erdogan's removal. But Erdogan, I believe he's got grandiose plans. The Saudis, they have their own plans. The United States kind of coordinates the three. And, it kind of reminds me, it's like, unfortunately, a lot of the Middle East has this problem where they're too busy fighting with each other on little, a lot of, you see on the internet, they'll be fighting over some little, minute problem or whatever that each government has with each other or something like that. Totally forgetting about the bigger players in the game, the bigger sharks in this big sea of warfare and everything. And I blame some of the some of the Gulf state media. Of course, there's like what fuels that fire a little bit. There's like Al Jazeera. There's also the joke that is Memory TV that ultimately gets like parodied. It's a pretty interesting news channel for all the people that are listening and haven't checked it out. There's also like a random Memory TV screenshots out of context page, and it shows like the most wild moments from it. I go on there quite every now and then when I need a good laugh. I'll go on there. Also, it's like all those other ones. What's the
Memory is Israeli, isn't it?
Well, I thought Memory was but it doesn't like cater to Arabs. Like a lot of Arabs will read it, but it's like ultimately
that's
like,
the point. I mean, if you, I'm just looking it up now. It was formed by a man named Yigal Kamon.
Okay, that's
so.
Does not
I think yeah. I mean, you can't say that it's Israeli, but he used to. I mean, there is like it's located in the United States. But one of the things that I constantly hear from Arabs about Memory, I'll make this a quick point because I know you were saying something, but one of the things that they always say is that the purpose of Memory TV is so that the Americans or even the Israelis can get some of the most backward, idiotic, and moronic Arabs on TV and like present them as like representatives of Muslims and Arabs in general. You know, they have some good people on Memory as well. I'm not dissing everyone that goes on Memory.
Yeah, I haven't watched too much of their news channel to say like everybody that goes on there. I just see like the few snippets here and there, and it's always like they'll have some guy on there that's talking about like there was like some screenshot or whatever, and there's like some guy from Saudi Arabia or something like that talking about like it's like, oh yeah, if you have a slave wife or something like that, you should let your guest have pleasure or something like that. I'm like, my God, exactly. I hope that people are not actually like seeing this over here in whatever Western countries, be like, oh, that must be what all Arabs are like, even though that ultimately Saudis are small percentage, and probably even a small percentage of Saudis are even like that. Nevertheless, the people of the Middle East as a whole, really, the weird thing is that some of the people that I've talked to from Iran and Syria, well, more from Iran. I have quite a few Facebook friends over there in Iran, and the way that they ultimately seem to talk when it comes to rights as a whole, how people should be treated as a whole, sometimes they sound more advanced in many ways than, some of the people that even call themselves progressives, so-called progressives here in America. That there's some of the most, advanced, I think, when it comes to human rights and in Iran. And also, when it comes to religious tolerance, a lot of people believe that Iran has no religious tolerance, that if you're not Muslim, you're treated badly. Well, that's totally not true. I see that the way that they believe Jews and Christians should be treated, and the people in Iran seem to be very advanced in that. And in fact, I've seen stories about apparently how the Jews that live there are treated 100% equally, and that a lot of them are very loyal to the Islamic Republic, the government of the Islamic Republic. The few Jews that live in Iran, there's not too many these days, but I still think there's like 25,000, tens of thousands of Jews that still live in Iran. Also,
well, there's also like the thing about Iran is, I mean, there is one group that faces religious persecution, and that's the Baha'is. But the reason for that is because the Baha'is have been accused by the government of being, agents of Israel and things like. Personally, I think there is a legitimate case to be made that they do face persecution. But yeah, I mean, Jews and Christians they're allowed to practice their faith. I mean, the only restrictions against them are the restrictions that come from living in a conservative, theocratic government. But like countries change. I mean, like Iran, for example, has gone through major changes since the revolution in 1979. It's a significantly more liberal place than it once was, and part of the reason for that is the sanctions. I mean, I always talk about how it's important not just to talk about what the United States does to countries, but also to factor in the resistance. The Iranian resistance to the American sanctions has been to pursue self-sufficiency. And the only way they can do that is if they have an educated population. And for that, they need women in particular to be very educated, right? And so what you have in Iran is a very, very educated female population, So just wanted to add that about Iran.
Yeah, definitely. I think that when it comes to Iran, the women seem to be treated very well compared to many countries, not just in the Middle East, but all around the world. I mean, I have family in Colombia. That's where I've been before. I've seen Colombia, and there's a lot of American allies, even American allies that are not so known to be this way, that still have very backwards rules when it comes to either treating women, treating minorities. I mean, Colombia, it's forgotten about, and it's often forgotten about in Latin countries that are backed by the United States, is that oftentimes these countries have still racial segregation, whether it's de facto or whether it's actual written in the laws. In Colombia, blacks might not be by the law segregated, but when it comes to de facto, the way how they're treated, they're definitely segregated. They often live in the slums, in the mountains of cities. They ultimately have some of the worst jobs, if they even have a job in there. And ultimately how the society sees them is very low. In many ways, it almost resembled kind of like a Jim Crow type of segregation. It's pretty alarming when you go over there and you hear people talk about blacks there. And also, it reminds me of how back in the 50s, prior to Castro taking over Cuba, how Cuba was. That Cuba used to be very strict against their black population. And that's a country that has an actually larger black population than Colombia. Colombia is only about 8%, I believe, while Cuba has many African descendants live in Cuba. And this has been in many Middle Eastern countries, or not Middle Eastern, sorry, a little slip there. I mean, in many Latin American countries, and also going back to the Middle East, is that you see, of course, there's ultimately, and the American-backed allies, they are the way they treat women over there. America has no. They're not really they're not even apologetic really about the way that they select their friends. Is that America often says that, well, this is the best out of the bunch. This is the most democratic country that will pick or whatever, or this is just what's best for America. Nowadays, unfortunately, a lot of the people don't even care about foreign policy enough, and what has happened in America is that they've been so blinded by nationalistic and ultimately rhetoric of bettering the people here, with the whole Trump, the whole Trump wave and all that, is that they're not worried about who the American government supports, but they're more worried about kicking out the immigrants out of our own country. That's going to be a huge hurdle when it comes to, making any kind of changes here in America and pushing any changes on our government to change your foreign policies. The fact is that the people are so distracted and do not care about foreign policy. It's literally like the last on their list of what to worry about. With Bernie Sanders, I often pointed out during his campaign, the massive flaws with his foreign policy. He was still pushing the regime change ideas in his form, and when he talked about Syria, a few times it even came out of his mouth, he still labeled Iran as a terrorist supporter, and he labeled North Korea also as the country we should actually be most worried about. Still pushing the same neocon narrative lie. When, for me, the last real politician that ran any kind of campaign here in America, presidential level, was Ron Paul, that actually opposed the American foreign policy. And it might not have been really out of the idea that it's really immoral. It was more like it's going to cost us too much money to do all these regime change policies, so we shouldn't do that. It was like the strong libertarian, almost like the anarcho-capitalist sense of why we should oppose American foreign policy. But any way that you oppose foreign policy of America, I'll welcome it, even if it's not really for moral reasons, like more of the people on the left often it's purely out of moral reasons or more out of wanting to oppose imperialism as a whole. Even though I think that with Ron Paul, it was moral as well. I believe that he was the last real character politician that we've had at that level, that high of a politician. And we have like Tulsi Gabbard nowadays, but then again, Gabbard is still pro-Israel. Ron Paul really was never pro-Israel. In fact, you look at like some of the Israeli newspapers, what they have to say about Ron Paul, and they've labeled him as like an anti-Semite. If the Israeli newspaper labeled you as an anti-Semite, there's a good chance that you're doing something right.
Yeah, probably. But that being said, I don't trust a lot of these libertarians who, prior to being elected or while they're in opposition, they like to claim that they're against American foreign policy and that they're in favor of isolationism, because the United States has a long tradition of isolationism. The traditional, Republican ethos or whatever was that, we want trade with all nations and alliances with none. Like it's a very common American thing that's always been said. And so whenever I hear this kind of rhetoric, I tend to brush it to one side simply because I don't think someone like that coming to power would be able to change American foreign policy simply because there's a logic to what it is that the United States does overseas. So, for example, I'm sure you know about the petrodollar, yeah?
Yes, I'm familiar with the concept.
Yeah, so the thing about the petrodollar is that the United States has an interest in ensuring that some of the world's major oil exporters sell in US dollars because that maintains the value of the American currency, which is absolutely crucial right now because the United States is in a trade deficit. Anyone who knows anything about economics knows that if you run trade deficits, then the value of your currency will collapse, right? But the value of the American currency isn't collapsing. In fact, whenever there's a crisis, people American dollars because they see that as being more secure. American dollars and gold, right? And so what they realize is that, okay, people like that generally, I think, would come to power and they'd say, okay, isolationism is in America's best interest. And then they'd be confronted with the reality that if they don't control the Middle East, that if they allow the resistance axis, as we mentioned before, to form a contiguous bloc with Iran as the major power, then that does undermine America's interests, right? It does undermine the value of the American currency, and it can unravel the American empire.
Well, yeah, a lot of us on the alternative media, that's one of the major things that we talk about is the petrodollar, and that's part of the reason why these wars are going to continue. Petrodollar is starting to unravel. A lot of the countries are no longer trading oil for dollars, and we're starting to see a massive shift over to the Chinese yuan, to the ruble, their currencies. So I think eventually, that's another reason why, like I said, is that I think that the establishment are in panic. The people that ultimately run America are in panic as they realize that business is not as normal right now. There are massive things that are shifting around the world, and even though that they've been able to put a little bit of a halt to a couple of the banking projects that would actively oppose them. For example, they've been able to destabilize BRICS to an extent. They've been able to push back in South America, where there was the Banco do Sur project that would have effectively pretty much gave South America own economic destiny. What has happened? What is ultimately the establishment doing right now is that they're trying to plug these holes with their fingers, a few holes on a dam that's about to break open, and ultimately that dam's going to break open, and there's going to be some serious restructuring, some serious things that are going to happen. I mean, a lot of the economists are predicting that we're going to see a major dollar event. I won't say a dollar collapse, perhaps, and that might be a little dramatic, but there's going to be a massive event, whether that's a recession, whether that's depression, whether that's a total collapse, kind of like what happened in multiple countries in the past, even perhaps like what happened in Germany in the 1920s, early 1920s, where they ultimately lost their money was worth 1 trillion times less at the end. Now, I don't think that's going to happen, but we might see a massive inflation event. And also, that's what's scary as Americans, to see how dependent everybody is on the status quo. That ultimately, when that status quo collapses, there's going to be some serious shit that's going to happen. I mean, they'll fight over a TV at Best Buy on Black Friday. Imagine what happens when that's over the last steak, that's over the last piece of chicken over at the Winn-Dixie at the grocery store. When that happens, there's going to be some chaos. Now, I'm not trying to be alarmist, but I can only imagine. I mean, I live here in the United States. I've seen, I'm also very young. I'm 19. So I've seen this new generation and the way their mentality, a lot of these people's mentality, is that it's all, unfortunately, it's a lot of these people border on being sociopathic. It's whatever it would take to survive would be their mentality, a lot of these people, and they're not going to help their neighbor. They're not going to band together like in many countries. You see in many countries when there's a serious problem, ultimately the people, the neighborhood, they get together and they try to make it work for the community. That won't happen here. It's going to be a free-for-all. The petrodollar right now, what ultimately the establishment knows is that they need to be able to sustain it for at least a few more years because if it breaks loose right now, it will be chaos, and ultimately there'll be kind of essentially a power vacuum that will happen. The government influence will be severely diminished. I think that's what ultimately, when you see these plans for martial law, Rex 84, all these bills that have been brought about here in the United States government, that's one of the major things that they're planning for. It's not just potentially like a major war, is what that whole emergency situation contingency plans would be rolled out, but ultimately also an economic collapse could bring out the new, pretty much the new government. As right now, it would no longer be Washington, D.C. as we know it. It would be the Pentagon and ultimately the FEMA controlling or ultimately locking down the states. And people say it's wild conspiracy theories, but however, it's all in legislation. Rex 84 goes back to the 1980s, and it was originally an immigration thing that's been pretty much changed into a all-out, all types of crises. They would, start going into pretty much emergency mode, and that emergency mode is pretty much martial law. People are taken away from the general population and put somewhere else. But when it comes to how it all relates to the foreign policy, is that right now is that the American government's trying to secure whatever last allies will trade in oil. But I think that it's not too long before there's a serious economic consequences to that. Even Saudi Arabia, I believe, was going to start trading yuan or something like that for oil. One of America's closest allies, is that they're not even going to be exclusively on dollars anymore. And you have to remember, it's that the dollar is not a currency that's backed by anything but petroleum, practically. Back in the day, way back before the Federal Reserve, before it became a private, before it became currency, and before it was money. Currency does not have to be backed by anything. Technically, when you talk about semantics, money has to either be a metal of intrinsic value or a note that is backed by that. Way back, we had the silver certificates, we had the gold certificates. Now we have nothing. It's not backed by anything. It's why what the Federal Reserve tells us it's backed by, and it's backed by the face of the American people. That $20 bill costs the same to print as the $1 bill, or maybe a little bit more for whatever more ink they have to use. That $1 bill is pretty much the same as the $100 bill. When you think about that, it's practically like monopoly money. A lot of countries, they have ways of backing their money so it's actually worth something. Our money, when you really think about it, is worth nothing. And ultimately, when the commodities that trade in are gone, when petroleum goes and whatever other commodities that are traded, really that's the main one. When the petroleum commodities are no longer traded by dollars, it will be worthless. And it will be just pretty much like any other piece of paper. The Federal Reserve is a private bank. It's not even part of our government. That's what people forget about.
Chris,
yeah.
Can I just say something? Currencies do not. This is like kind of wildly off topic, I guess, but like currencies don't really have to be backed by anything. Like fiat currencies, for example, the way they work is that the government prints off a bunch of paper, and that bunch of paper is supposed to correspond to a certain level of economic activity. It's supposed to correspond to a certain number of goods and services that are being produced by the economy, right? And as those goods and services in the real economy grow, the money supply can be increased, right? So money supply is supposed to increase with productivity. It doesn't necessarily have to be backed by anything.
Well, I'm saying is that's the thing. Currency doesn't have to be backed by anything, but technically, from what I've heard, is in the law dictionary, money is what has to be backed by anything. The original term money was anything that was a metal of intrinsic value or a note backed by a metal of intrinsic value. That's what I understood from
maybe
it.
in definitional terms, you're absolutely correct, because in history, money was backed by something like by gold or something like that. But eventually, ultimately it comes down to this: why would I want to buy someone else's currency? Because I think that currency can be used to buy something. Now, if I buy American dollars, right, historically it would have been because there's something that's available within the American market that I want to buy, right? Now, the thing is now, because the United States is an empire, what I can buy with American dollars is not confined to simply what's inside the United States or within the American market. It's oil, which is like an international commodity, And so that's how the United States is able to have these trade deficits year after year after year without experiencing a devaluation of their currency. That's the way I see it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's, again, like I was saying, is that currency is based on faith that's worth something. That ultimately, is that I could, make like what happened with Bitcoin a long time ago, or not that long ago, is that a few years ago, is that pretty much they made an online currency and people believed it was worth something. They started trading it, and it was a currency. It was a cryptocurrency. It might not have been backed by any national bank or anything like that, but it's still a currency. Now, if I was to, perhaps make my own currency online or something like that, Chris dollars, and I started selling them and got some people to buy into the concept, and eventually 100,000 people were using them. Ultimately, and people, and then some retailers started taking Chris dollars, and I made my own cryptocurrency. Technically, in the end, I would have a currency and I'd be the owner of that currency. It's ultimately based on face of what it's backed by, or face that's worth something. Now, way back, we used to have the gold standard, until Nixon took it away in the 1970s. We used to actually have our money was backed by something tangible, by gold, by silver way back, by different metals it was backed by in history, and different countries have that. Ultimately, the American dollar we're going to be perpetually in a state of war because of the way that our Federal Reserve is structured, because of the way that our currency is printed. There's never going to be a point where they're not going to be seeking more petroleum, more natural resources in order to prop up that dollar. That's just the way it is right now. It's unfortunate. And, when you think about it more than just the perspective of talk about countries, you have to remember these are people's lives. These are hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people in the Middle East have been affected, and how many thousands of American soldiers have died for ultimately what they believed they were going to fight for freedom. They were going to fight for democracy. They were trying to free these countries, and ultimately it was for economic reasons. And Iraq, Afghanistan, more of the same. Go back to Vietnam. We lost 56,000 American soldiers in that war, and ultimately it wasn't because they were trying to free Vietnam from evil communism. It wasn't about that. There was economic reasons. There was much bigger fish that were fried than them worrying about one communist country. And the whole talk about containment, the dominoes or whatever, that was a lot of propaganda. But it's unfortunate. I see the people, some of the Vietnam vets or whatever on Facebook, and they're 70 years old now, and they're still, believing that they went there to free the Vietnamese people from the evil communist system or whatever. That they were, helping these freedom fighters, when ultimately, the South Vietnamese military, the whole plan to reunite Vietnam under capitalism was not about. It was ultimately a bigger part. There was also the opium. There was the banks. There was much bigger things at play.
So, Chris,
I saw your message actually, and thanks for being on the show this long. I mean,
no
you were on
worries,
here for a great conversation, and we're actually going to be wrapping up the show in a little bit, anyways. So, thanks for coming all the way from Australia. That's definitely the furthest guest I've ever had. I think that beats Ireland was probably the furthest I ever had, and it was interesting talking to you for sure. And I did not know, honestly. Seeing your Facebook, I did not know that you said you had the PhD, or you're going to get the PhD.
No. I'm currently studying my PhD at Sydney University. So my topic is about energy interests and the conflicts in the Middle East generally. I'm also a member of Hands Off. Sorry.
That's really quite the accomplishment there. So big congrats to that. I don't think I've ever had it, or actually I've had one PhD on before. You're not the first. But it does not happen every day.
It's okay. I mean, it was something that I've always wanted to do, and I'm also a member of Hands Off Syria here in Sydney. So, shout out to them, I guess. And we, as a part of my organization, Hands Off Syria, I've been to Syria. So I was there 2 years ago. We have raised money for various charities in Syria. We've had seminars. We had a conference recently at Sydney University, which was very, very well attended because people really want to know our side of the story. And I mean, we've done a lot of organizing around the Syrian question, and we appreciate any independent media outlet that's keen on learning about the other side of the story, including your own. So thank you very much for having me on.
And before you go, I mean, I've had other charities, and I've had one other charity before that was promoting helping the East Ukrainian people on. So I have no problem if you give a shout out to whatever Syrian charities you want to shout out right now.
Mhm.
And if you want to give a
Syrian
link or something.
Syrian Trust for Development. That's the one. That's the one that I would really encourage people to get behind. The Syrian Trust for Development is a non-government organization. It was created by Syrians in Syria, and they deal with, for example, refugee, like the internal refugee problem that they're facing. So most people don't realize that the vast majority of refugees inside Syria are internally. The vast majority of refugees, Syrian refugees, are internally displaced, and so this is an organization that helps them. The other one is WAFA, WAFA, and of course the Syrian Red Crescent.
Thanks. I'll definitely check them out, and hopefully some of my listeners will check them out. Yeah, it was great having you on the show, and hopefully we'll be in touch again.
Okay, no worries. See ya.
See ya. By the way, to everyone that's listening right now, the Voice of Rebellion Radio, we're at 10:40 Eastern Time. So if anybody wants to call in at this moment, the number is going to be 718-717-8296, 718-717-8296. And by the way, this is actually me, not a recording. I am live here at Voice of Rebellion Radio, UCY.TV, the one and only. By the way, I'm going to give a shout out right now to Jules, who makes this all possible, makes this possible for me to have guests all the way from Australia live on the air. Definitely great having Jay on. And not every day do I have aspiring PhD. I've had one PhD on here before, which was Rosalind Fuller. But I don't think I've had her on UCY.TV now I think about it. I had her on prior shows of Voice of Rebellion Radio. There was two on Stable Radio. And kind of hoping that I might be able to bring her back on UCY.TV in the future. Right, definitely check out those charities that Jay mentioned. Any help to the Syrian people is definitely welcomed. And, I've shouted out to my Sergei Barlashov's charity to the East Ukrainian people. And when it comes to Syrian people, ultimately also I would like to shout out any charity that's willing to help them. By the way, and I'm going over, I've talked about my main three countries that I seem to talk about. And I think that's maybe the most important countries in the fight against imperialism worldwide is Ukraine, Syria, Venezuela. And also when it comes to Venezuela, I have my own little projects going on. It's not a charity or anything, but it's a page of supporters of Chavez in Colombia, Chavistas in Colombia, which has been a wild ride. Like the last week, I started actually paying for the sponsoring or whatever, on Facebook. I paid $5 a day or something like that in order to sponsor my page. So I've got a lot more likes the last week. But with all that being said, it brought a lot of people that were very hostile to my page in the last week. I get all these messages or whatever of, all these angry people. Sometimes there'll be the Uribe supporters, which are a joke. Uribe is the epitome of the Operation Condor type politician. And he 100% follows the American foreign policy into anything that South America, anything that they're behind South America. And he calls Castro and Chavez dictators, just a typical mainstream line. Uribe is a complete joke. He's like the Donald Trump of Colombia. And I am every time I can't believe that a lot of Uribe supporters are very poor. Uribe is also like kind of the epitome of right-wing populism, the left-wing populism, and is that we have these people like Trump, Geert Wilders, these fake nationalists that ultimately just use nationalism as a front to support their pro-corporate policies. They've been able to sway people more than the left-wing populists have, and that's a major problem worldwide. Not just in Colombia, it's a problem in it was like a problem in Holland. It was a problem. It's been a problem in many different countries. The United States, we've seen. Not that there was really a good option, but Donald Trump's right-wing populism was able to sway people, and there's still a lot of people who are supportive of Trump because of his rhetoric, but not looking at his actions. And what he's done in the first few months of his presidency. Donald Trump, how many times have I mentioned his name on the show? It's almost infuriating to have watched the descent of Trump from this potential hero of the average man in America all the way down to now we see the Donald Trump of the neocon establishment, the Trump of the New World Order, another New World Order puppet. And all these people that said that they would never support another politician because they're all New World Order puppets ended up supporting Trump 100%. Ended up supporting Trump. Trump is, just remember, is that Trump's just another fascist. He's another one of them. And there's also other people that think that it was all fine till Trump became president, are 100% blind. That people think that there was not problems under Obama, there was not problems under Bush. There was huge problems. It was ultimately the same game. Bush, Obama, Trump, all these different politicians, all members of the same group. And it's the same club that we're not in. George Carlin used to talk about this club that we're not in. It was like the billionaires, the oligarchy, the government, the establishment, the whatever you want to call them, Bilderbergers. These people are from that organization, and they're here to make our lives, to pretty much just turn us into labor units, to totally disregard us, and to help out their buddies. And we're already at 10:45. So that was about an hour call that we had right there between me and Jay. It was very interesting, to say the least. And to have a guest all the way from over there was pretty cool. And right now, going over to different, I was talking about Syria. Let's go over to Venezuela. Is that in Venezuela, the protests have continued. The very large protests against the government, but have been met with pretty big rallies for the government. However, what I've mainly seen is the protests against the government. And I think that, with Capriles and Leopoldo Lopez and this core of this opposition, it's so rotten to the core, and ultimately are some of the biggest globalist hacks. And I see the people on Facebook defending the opposition. They don't realize that who the opposition is ultimately backed by. And the reason why they want to take out Venezuela is because they don't have a Rothschild bank. Venezuela has been gripped by economic war. But people act like this is not the first time it's happened. It happened in Zimbabwe as well. And this is part of the way that they do, is that they start an economic war against a government they don't like, and then it makes their leader look like an asshole because their people are starving, their people are suffering. But it's not the fault of the leader, it's the fault of outside forces that are looking to strangle the economy. Zimbabwe ultimately fell victim to the economic war. They had to trade their currency for the Chinese yuan. And I think that Venezuela, that's what they're trying to do, is ultimately devalue their bolivar until the point where they're going to be having to use a foreign currency. Now, they've been able to devalue the bolivar with they've been able to devalue the bolivar with the use of the dollar today, and there's been that was one of the websites that was there to devalue the bolivar. There's been other methods of doing so. But I think that Venezuela has been their currency has fared decently, actually, in the whole scheme of things when it comes to how long they've been trying to interfere with the country. Is that this is a country that they've been trying to interfere with for 15, 16 years now, and Venezuela is still surviving. And that's the thing that, like Jay was talking about, is that ultimately nationalist, grandiose projects ultimately get changed into survival, into just trying to make it as a country, rather than huge projects, huge plans of how they're gonna, like liberate Palestine when it comes to Syria and Iran, or when it comes to Venezuela, Banco do Sur, and huge, much bigger projects get halted by that, by war, by sanctions, or whatever way that they're making their lives difficult. And they have many ways of doing so. In Syria, they've totally fractured that country into many smaller pieces. They've been able to make their lives very difficult, and now the Syrian people are no longer thinking about, their Palestinian brothers. They're thinking about liberating themselves. Now ultimately they're practically being occupied by foreign forces, even though that they call themselves Syrian rebels. They're not Syrian. They're from like 82 different countries. Syrian opposition is a proxy for the West, a proxy for the United States, a proxy for the UK and other Western governments against the Syrian government, which also does not have a Rothschild bank. When you look at it, that's the common denominator practically between all the countries that that actively work against, is that the fact that the Rothschild's presence is not there, and that they are effectively fighting against Rothschild banking forces. That's really all it comes down to in the end. There's many other reasons. There's the pipeline that there's two conflicting pipelines between the Russia-backed pipeline and the United States-backed pipeline, but ultimately in the end, there's just that one reason that the ultimately that will warrant war. In Venezuela, they try to make it seem like it's about human rights. In Syria, they try to make it seem like it's about human rights. Human rights is the narrative in Ukraine. But there's no the human rights is not the concern. They back the Saudi government. They back Saddam back in the 80s. They have no qualms about supporting dictatorial regimes. And people think that I'm exaggerating when I say that the United States government is behind, or the United States government, the bankers behind the United States government and the Zionists are behind most of the wars that exist today. But it's totally true. I think that making a generalized statement like that is not inaccurate. And going back to what like Mel Gibson says, that the Zionists are behind all the wars, I'm not 100% against that statement, because ultimately the people at the top, the bankers, the establishment there, they're all political Zionists. Political Zionism goes much further than Israel, much further than the Middle East. It goes global. And that was one of the first shows I did, was showing how Zionism is a global problem, not just a regional problem, not just a problem with the Palestinians. And that's why we must defend the Palestinians partially, is because it's part of the bigger struggle against Zionism worldwide. You see the way that they influence our politicians, they influence British politicians, they influence French politicians. I mean, look at the power they have in Britain. Is that Jeremy Corbyn has kicked out members of his party, of the Labour Party, for making statements critical to Israel. There was Livingstone, and there was the other guy. I'm trying to think what was the other person that got kicked out of Labour. See, that was the UK politics, like Ollie Richardson was talking about, which was one of our guests, is that the problem with UK politics is that there's practically no one of any value in the UK that's of any high position. When it comes to Corbyn, it doesn't even seem like it's a good option. And then you have people like the jokes that are Farage, the UKIP, the Tories, and Theresa May, who is ultimately one of the most decrepit, rotten politicians in all of the Europe. There's no real good options in Europe or in the UK. The United States is very, very similar, where we have what Tulsi Gabbard might be the highest level politician that opposes anything that the United States foreign policy does, and she still seems to be behind Israel. Every congressman, every senator, it appears, has to support Israel in order to become a senator or congressman. And I'm not going to say that Israel's behind everything. Ultimately, there's bankers that are behind Israel. And there's ideological differences between those countries that are they're under those bankers. But in the end, the New World Order and the Rothschilds that are the ultimate enemy to freedom, to democracy across the world. And like JFK was talking about, the monolithic conspiracy. A lot of people think that the monolithic conspiracy was communism. But the monolithic conspiracy that he was talking about was the Rothschilds and the secret societies that he even mentioned. Why would he mention secret societies if he was talk about the communism, talk about the Soviet Union? And some people say the monolithic conspiracy because he said that all communism stemmed from Moscow. I don't buy that. I don't buy that at all. Monolithic conspiracy was the New World Order that he was talking about in that speech, and that's why eventually he was killed. And also because he was trying to reinstate the silver certificates and trying to end the Fed. And you notice that Donald Trump's, all the talk that he had about the Fed during his campaign is gone. The Fed's not going to get audited. The wall is not going to get built, even though that's not a positive thing. But the wall is not going to be built. Trump is going to be like any other politician that we've had in recent years. But people bought into it. People bought into the sales pitch. He sold you the car he was trying to sell. The wall was the little TV that you get for the car, and a lot of people bought into it just for that. And also, here's another thing, is that if the wall would help, remember that most of these people come by airplane, they overstay their visa. Illegal immigration also is a result of not because these people are trying to suck our welfare system, because these people are being chased out of their own country by warfare. Mexico has the drug war that's going on, fueled by American guns, fueled by the American government and their own corrupt government, all working as a dirty trio. And they also have a big problem with poverty. A lot of the reason why Mexico sucks, why their government sucks, is because the American government influencing it. And, there's also from many other Central American countries, and you have countries like the Honduras or Guatemala, also backed by American leaders, American-backed leaders. Also, we look at the Honduras, is that the American government overthrew an anti-American government in 2009 was Zelaya. Something that you heard about back in the 70s and 80s is still going on to this day. And this was an armed coup. This is guns and everything. Similar to what happened with Correa. They tried to overthrow him a few years back. And they tried to overthrow Chavez in 2002. But they had a successful armed coup just in 2009. And that's one of the things that was not talked about during the campaign of Donald Trump and Hillary, that Hillary was the Secretary of State when this happened. A massive blockage of democracy happened right then, just a few years back in 2009. Talk about 7 years prior to the election. By the way, we are ending the show right now. We're at 10:57. Thanks everyone who tuned in to Voice of Rebellion Radio, or wherever you are tuned in from UCY TV to Real Liberty Media, wherever you are tuned in from. Thanks a lot for tuning in. If you're tuning in from YouTube later, thanks for tuning in. We'll be back live next week, May 28th, as we are in the final week of May. Will be Memorial Day weekend, and then we'll be in June. Wow, 2017 is going by pretty quickly. And let's see if we're at war with Syria by next week as we descend closer to World War III. Tell everybody to stay safe out there, stay vigilant. You don't know how things are going to change, so stay informed. And I'll be doing podcasts at Chris Jackson Rojas' Facebook page. I'll try to do one daily, especially with these high tensions and everything that's going on. I think it's imperative that I try to stay on the radio as much as possible. Hopefully I'll have more guests down the road. And last 2 weeks we've had a caller, so that's definitely good. So, and by the way, if you want to call in, don't be scared. I'm not going to shame you for not being informed on whatever topic or whatever, or having a disagreement, as long as it's peaceful. Unlike what's been happening on my page, or at Chavistas in Colombia, where we have being called all these different names or whatever, not realizing I'm just going to block them because I don't give a shit. I'm not. If you don't come at me respectfully, why should I even give you a chance? It's different between respectful disagreement and just getting a flame war. And that's what a lot of people seem to want to do on the internet, is they want to get them a flame war. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in. We should be hitting the bumpers here in a few seconds. We sign off with Immortal Technique, Point of No Return. Song at the beginning, by the way, is Immortal Technique, Rich Man's World. We have Immortal Technique at both ends of the show.
It's the point of no return and nobody can stop it. Malcolm Little when he knelt before Elijah Muhammad, the comet that killed the dinosaurs, changing the earth. They love to criticize, they always say I changed for the worse. Like prescription pills when you misusing them, nigga. The Templar Knights when they took Jerusalem, nigga, and figured out what was buried under Solomon's temple. Al-Aqsa, the name is not coincidental. I know too much, the government is trying to murder me. No coming back like cutting your wrists open vertically. How could the serpent be purposely put in charge of the country? Genetic engineered sickness spread amongst me. My people are so hungry that they attack without reason, like a fucking dog ripping off the hand that feeds them. Immortal Technique is treason to the Patriot Act. So come and get me, motherfucker, cause I'm not coming back. This is the point from which I can never return. And if I back down now, then...
You're listening to UCY.tv. Why don't you stick